In this video, we're going to talk about delegates and creating them in VisualBasic.net. Now, delegates are a new concept to VB programmers, but really if you think back to your use of events or callbacks in Visual Basic 6 and before that, you'll get some of the basic concepts to begin with. But you'll find that VB.net delegates are a lot more flexible. As I was researching this topic, I found a lot of different definitions for delegates, but essentially a delegate is a special class that represents a method signature. Now, what is a method signature? It's all the parameters and the return type that you have for a given method. So a delegate class can be assigned to have a certain number of parameters of certain types and then also a return type. And then you will create instances of the delegate and assign different methods within your application to become the delegate, and then pass in arguments to that delegate which represents your function. Now you might be at your head spinning at this point, as mine first was, trying to understand exactly why you'd use that. And it'll make more sense in just a moment as we walk through a real example of how to use delegates within your applications. You can also think of delegates as function pointers, but they're very object-oriented function pointers. So if you're familiar with C or C++ and you've dealt with function pointers in the past, that is the concept of delegates, with the exception that they're strongly typed. In other words, that the method signature that you define has to be used exactly in each of the methods that will actually implement the delegate. In the past, in C and C++, these were not type-safe delegates, and therefore you could go ahead and pass in a function that didn't represent what the initial delegate was defined as, but not so in C# and VB.net. Delegates are also used, as we noted a moment ago, to implement callbacks and events in VisualBasic.net. You'll use delegates whenever you have a scenario where you need the application to notify a certain chunk of code, a certain function, whenever its turn comes around to perform an operation on a given set of data. So before we go into a code example, I want to give you kind of a roadmap of what it takes to create and use a delegate within your VisualBasic.net applications. The first step that you'll take is to actually define a delegate, and then you'll create an instance of that delegate. You'll use the address of function to get a reference to a real procedure that you have within your application, and you store it into the delegate instance. So that reference to a real procedure that has to have the same method interface or the same method signature of the delegate that you created. Then the next step is when the instance is invoked to actually use the procedure that's run using any parameters that are passed into the delegate instance. So when at that point your delegate actually represents the procedure that you defined and set to the instance of the delegate. And then finally the delegate instance can be reassigned as often as you want to refer to a different procedure if that's what you want. So without further ado, let's take a look at some code, and some of these things will become evident. You want to make sure to get a copy of the source code that's available from the same place where you downloaded the actual video, because I've added a lot of comments, a lot of notes that will help you understand a little bit more about delegates as you go through this very simple sample that I've created. So the first step that we're going to take is to actually, as we said, define a delegate, and we do that with the following code. Delegate, sub, and then the name of our delegate, print message, and then whatever we want the method signature to look like. In this case, we're going to take one string value as an input parameter. So we've created a definition of our delegate. The next step that we'll take is to actually create some functions or procedures that share that same method signature. So here we've created print hello and print goodbye. Notice that they both have a string, a single string, as their input parameter. Now, these functions are able to do, these procedures are able to do whatever they want to. They can change the value of the that's passed in. They can save it off. They can write it to a console. That is up to your application to decide what happens within the context of these functions. But ultimately, we're going to have two functions that are going to be assigned to the delegate at different points within our application. Then the next step is to create an instance of our delegate, as we do right here. Dim PM as print message. And print message, as I hover my mouse cursor over it, is defined as a delegate. The next step is to use the address of to get the address of the print hello method or procedure that we created above. So address of print hello, and you assign that to our delegate instance. Now we call our delegate instance and pass in a value, in this case Dave. Let me ask you, what do you think will happen at this point? If you guess that, it will actually call the print hello function and pass in Dave, in which case we'll get a printout of hello Dave. You're absolutely correct. That's exactly what will happen, because PM, as a result of this line, refers to print hello. Now notice what happens. We're going to do something here and reassign the value of PM. PM will now equal the address of print goodbye. So when we call PM again and send in Dave, what do you suppose will happen this time? Since PM now represents the print goodbye procedure, what we'll see is print goodbye, or I'm sorry, goodbye Dave, which is passed in. So let's go ahead and save our function and compile it. So I've navigated to my projects folder where I've created this application. The project's name was VB Delegates, and I went into the bin folder. I'm going to type in VB Delegates, hit enter, and I get hello Dave, goodbye Dave. That's exactly what we wanted to see. Why? Because again, we called our function when it represented print hello, and we called our delegate here when it represented print goodbye. Now you might be wondering to yourself, why in the world would I ever use delegates? It seems like a pretty simple concept, and that's true, but we want to note something very quickly here. First of all, that our example was pretty simple. It only had one parameter of type string, but in fact delegates can have any number of parameters, and they can be of any allowable type within the .NET framework. Also, our delegate was just part of a module. However, delegates can be defined wherever a class can be defined. So it can be part of another class, or it can be independent within it by itself. And then also our delegate returned nothing, but delegates can return any allowable type as well. So now that we've looked into the basic of delegates, I want to talk about something a little more advanced, multicast delegates. And this is really where the magic of delegates come in, that you can link multiple delegate instances together in what's called multicasting. In other words, you can add delegate instances to a call chain and have each of those operate on a given set of data. So in our example, we could create one delegate instance and then add two address of statements, the address of hello and the address of goodbye, and then call our PM once, and it will execute both of those functions with only one call. So we can add delegate instances by using the combine method, or we can remove delegate instances using the remove method, which I will not demonstrate here. Now this is one thing that's important when you're working with multicast delegates, that only the last method returns a value. So in your call chain you may have added like 5 or 6 methods that will all act on the same data. However, only the last one that's executed will actually return a value back. We're not going to demonstrate that in this video, but please keep in mind that little tip whenever you're developing your applications using multicast delegates. So to illustrate this concept, what I've done is added some additional code at the very bottom of our previous example, and what we did was use our already created instance of PM, and first assigned it to the address of print hello. So that's a statement that looks very similar to what we did earlier in this video. And then I create a PM equals PM.combine. Use the combine method to pass in our current instance of PM. What does that represent? It represents print hello currently. And we're also going to combine it with this statement here, which is get the address of print goodbye and then cast it to a print message delegate and combine them together and add them into PM. So now I'm going to call PM and pass in the value Steve. What do you think will happen when we do this? What will happen is that the first thing will happen is it'll say print, it'll call the print hello method, and the second thing is that it will call the print goodbye method, and it will pass Steve into both of those methods. So you can chain these calls together. Let's go ahead and save and then rebuild our solution. And now let's bring up our command window and type in vbdelegates. Hit enter. So we get our output from the previous try. Hello, Dave, goodbye, Dave. And we also get hello, Steve, goodbye, Steve. We only sent in the value Steve once, but since we have a multicast delegate, it notified the print hello and the print goodbye of the fact that it was their turn to operate on the input parameter, in this case was Steve. So there are a couple scenarios that I think this could be helpful. Whenever, for example, you might have an inventory situation or some type of ordering situation where you need to enact on a set of data that goes in. Maybe it's products that have come into the warehouse, or maybe it's products that are going to be sold, and you need to calculate tax, you need to calculate quantity on hand, maybe in reorder quantity, and you spin off various methods. One method might update the database, another method might write to a log file, another method might send an email, another method might page somebody on their pager, maybe when a reorder quantity is too low. There could be various scenarios, but you create all these methods and then chain them together for a given set of data, and then allow them to act on that data when it's their turn to act on it. Now, in the scenario that I just described, you would want to make use of asynchronous delegates, which basically means that you would spin off each of the calls to the multicast delegates on their own thread and allow them to perform in an asynchronous manner, so you don't have any blocking on long-running callbacks. So in other words, if you were to send that set of data in, and some of it needed to be written to the database, and then you needed to maybe send a fax on another thread, and you need to send an email on another thread, you wouldn't have to wait for these all to synchronously process before control returned back to the program. Instead, just spin off a bunch of threads, allow them to operate asynchronously, and then they'll all come back, and you won't have any blocking issues. So the application will execute a lot quicker. We'll talk about asynchronous delegates in a future video. But that pretty much sums up the basics of delegates. I hope that this was helpful. I know this is one of those topics that a lot of people are trying to get their hands around and really understand. So we're going to spend 2 or 3 more videos on the topic of delegates. Hope you enjoyed this video.